Hello, it's Fred Dinage. Thank you for joining me once again. Talking to you about crime and criminals, gangsters and killers. Talking this week about a gentleman called Freddy Foreman, known as Brown Bread Fred. Brown bread being the Cockney slang for dead. And that, of course, was the fate of more than one person who crossed Freddy Foreman and the Kray twins, Reggie and Ronnie. Indeed, in 1969, Freddy Foreman went down for 10 years for disposing of the body of Jack the Hat Mcvitie, who'd been stabbed to death by Reggie Kray, because disposal of bodies was Freddy Foreman's great speciality. He was very, very good at it. Now, of course, Mcvitie was killed by Reggie Kray in a dispute over money, stabbed to death. Freddy Foreman, the way he told me, well, he got a call in the early hours of the morning at home. He was asleep, fast asleep in bed. He got a call to say Mcvitie had been stabbed to death in this flat. They were trying to clean the flat up. Mcvitie's body had got to be got rid of. They put it in the back of a car. Two members of the Kray firm drove the car away. It then broke down. I'm not quite sure how or why, but it broke down and they abandoned the car with Mcvitie in the boot. Freddy Foreman got a call to say, the car's broken down, Mcvitie is in the boot. Can you go there? Can you get rid of the body? Which is what Freddie did. He went, found the car, got Mcvitie out of the boot, put him in his own boot, and then disposed of Mcvitie's body. No one is quite sure what happened to Jack the Hat Mcvitie, but his body was never found. Freddie's other major sentence was in 1983, when he got 9 years for his part in the Security Express robbery, which at the time was the biggest robbery of its kind. Freddie was very aggrieved about that, the way he was arrested, because he was living in Spain at the time, he told me, and he claims the British police came across and without the knowledge of the Spanish authorities actually kidnapped him and brought him back to London. He was very cross about that. When he finally got out, he went back to Spain and lived there for some years quite happily. Now, when we were making the Kray twins documentary some years ago, which has been repeated many times on Sky's Crime Channel, we wanted to interview Freddy Foreman. Would he do it? He said yes, he would. A very precise man was Freddie. He said he'd come across, he'd do it on a Saturday afternoon at 5 o'clock, which presumably fitted in with his aeroplane flight schedule. 5 o'clock he'd do it, in a cafe that the Kray twins used to frequent when they were in their heyday. But the cafe had to be empty. He was absolutely insistent on that. So the production team rang the manager of this cafe and said this is what they wanted to do, and the cafe needed to be empty. The manager said, that's going to be very difficult because that's a really busy time for us. Well, the production team said, we'll pay you a fee to empty the cafe for an hour between 5 and 6, and the manager agreed. I got there with the camera crew at about 4 o'clock, and the place was absolutely packed with people eating food, drinking tea and coffee, etc. At 4:30, it was still absolutely packed. The producer started to panic a little bit and said to the manager, look, the cafe's going to be empty at 5 o'clock for this interview, isn't it? And the manager said, well, it's a little bit difficult. You can see how crowded it is. It's going to be very difficult to get people to leave, I don't know what we're going to do. And the producer said, well, we're going to pay you a fee for this. We've agreed a fee for it. And he said, well, I'm not sure, to be quite honest. At 5 o'clock, Freddy Forman arrived, looked at the packed restaurant, cafe, and said, what the hell's going on? You said it was going to be empty. And the producer said, well, I'm sorry, we've agreed a fee with the manager, but he doesn't seem able to empty the cafe. At which point Freddy Forman called him over, took him into a back room. There was a fairly brief conversation. I don't know what was said, I can only imagine. But the manager came out and said to everybody in the cafe, I'm sorry, you've all got to go outside and sit at the tables outside, even though it's a bit cold and damp. I'm ever so sorry, but take your food and drink outside. Don't worry, there'll be nothing to pay. It'll be okay. The people sort of thought, oh, well, not too bad, grumbled a little bit, and they all left the restaurant. I sat down and spoke to Freddie for a good half an hour, and he was very, very, very frank in his replies. He spoke about the Kray twins and his association with them. He spoke particularly about Ronnie Kray and shooting of George Cornell in the Blind Beggar pub. He said it was a bit of a mystery how Ronnie had managed to shoot Cornell between the eyes because he said Ronnie was as blind as a bat. It must have been a complete fluke, a very unlucky fluke, as it turned out for Ronnie Kray. The other thing about Freddy Forman, which is interesting, is in his autobiography, Respect, he admits to the killing of two men. One was a man called Ginger Marks, who Freddie said had killed Freddie's brother some years before. He admitted to killing Marks in his autobiography. He also admitted to killing a man called Frank Mitchell, who was known as the Mad Axeman. Now, I'm going to talk about Frank Mitchell next time because it's a fascinating story, because the Kray twins managed to free him from Dartmoor prison. They took him back to London to a safe house, a flat in Barking, and then tried to convince the Home Secretary of the time, Roy Jenkins, that this man, Frank Mitchell, should be given parole. The Kray twins saw this as a way of proving they were completely invincible. The Home Secretary was having none of it, which left the Kray twins with a bit of a dilemma what to do with Frank Mitchell. He was persuaded to get into the back of a van, which would take him to another safe house in the country where he'd meet up with Ronnie Kray. But waiting in the van, and Freddy Foreman apparently admits this in his autobiography, Respect, Freddy Foreman was waiting inside the van with another member of the Kray firm, and they shot Frank Mitchell several times. Then they took his body down to the south coast of England, wrapped him up in chicken wire, and threw him into the sea. No one ever quite knew what happened to Frank Mitchell. That was Freddy Forman's version of it. Ronnie Kray, meanwhile, in his the book I wrote with the Kray twins, Our Story, their autobiography, Ronnie said, no. In fact, he was taken abroad to either Spain or South America or maybe even Australia, and he's now still alive and well. No one knows the true story, but I suspect Freddy Forman's version is probably closest to the truth. A fascinating man, Freddy Foreman, but a man never ever to cross. As I say, he was much involved in the death of Frank Mitchell, the Mad Axeman, and we'll talk about that next time. Hope you can join me.